Welcome back to Halloween month. Today we're going to be checking out JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, Battle Tendency. While it doesn't quite fit the Halloween mold that Part 1 did, it still has vampires, it still has crazy body contorting, body horror villains. The squirrel scene, and if you haven't seen the squirrel scene, if you've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, then there's my hint. And of course a cyborg Nazi. So I think it still fits Halloween a bit, but enough trying to justify it fitting in Halloween month. Let's talk about JoJo. Simply put, Battle Tendency is pretty much everything you could want in a sequel to JoJo. It's got its own feel and its own vibe without feeling too different from Part 1. Its main character doesn't feel like a retread of the first main character, and even when story beats or character beats are retreaded from the original, they feel earned and they make sense and they're done differently with their own unique flavor. On top of that, you have lore expansion on the stone masks and where they came from and who made them and where the vampires came from. Well, vampires come from stone masks, so finding out where the stone masks came from, it all comes full circle. They expand on Hamon and what you can do with it and the teachings of it, and it really does do everything you could want from a sequel, not retreading the original, but expanding upon it. And I understand that Part 2 isn't necessarily a sequel to Part 1. It's from the same exact series as far as the magazine goes, and it's literally a part of Season 1 as far as the anime goes, but still, it does act as a sequel, following a new main character, the grandson of Jonathan Joestar, Joseph Joestar, and I love that he's not anything like his grandfather. Like, Jonathan was an honorable gentleman to a fault, just a Boy Scout character, and I like him. I like Boy Scouts sometimes if they're done right, like Captain America in the Marvel movies. I guess you could say isn't quite as Boy Scout as like Jonathan Joestar, but still, the Boy Scout archetype, if they're done really well, I like them quite a bit, and Jonathan I did really like, but Joseph is on a whole nother level. This is my favorite JoJo by far of the 4 parts I've seen. He's amazing. I love Joseph Joestar. I almost said Jonathan. That's going to get fucking confusing. Let's just stop talking about Jonathan. We don't need to mention him anymore. Joseph is the street smart, conniving, trickery-using, sleight-of-hand guy who, he's awesome. Like, he has no honor. Like, I mean, he does have honor, but he's not like his grandfather. He's completely, totally in it for number one. He'll whip out a gun on you, grenades, trickery, sleight of hand. It's just awesome. He's such a cool character, and he'll even predict what people are about to say, and he's really eccentric with his oh no's and shit like that, and I would cut to an oh no compilation right now, but I don't want to make one. I don't have the time to make one, and I couldn't find any on YouTube, so shame on you JoJo fans for not making an oh no compilation. Specifically for Part 2. There's plenty of Part 3 ones. There's none for Part 2, so shame on you. But if you guys have seen JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, then you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to avoid spoilers for the most part, but if you've seen JoJo, then yeah, you know Joseph, and you know how awesome he is, or at least how eccentric he is. But yeah, I love that he's completely different. I love that the Zeppeli we get this in this part is completely different from the first one. The first Zeppeli we had, William Zeppeli, I believe his name was William, he was the mentor. You know, he was the wise mentor who was eccentric, but not anything crazy. You know, he was the wise mentor. And spoilers for Part 1, since we're talking about Part 2, you know, he passes away. He kind of, that hero's journey type thing. Part 1 really does follow the hero's journey story structure pretty closely. And Part 2, instead of being the wise mentor who dies, he's the rival to Joseph. He's a grandson of Zeppeli, but he's around the same age, and he's immature, and he matures a lot throughout the story. He really is a really well fleshed out character, and his bubbles are awesome, which I never thought I would ever say that. His bubbles, his Hamon bubbles are really cool and a really unique ability that I really like, and yeah, there's not really much else to say about Caesar, honestly. He's just a really fun character. I don't want to go too much into spoilers about how he develops and stuff, but it was really cool to see that same family lineage carry on, but so differently, you know what I mean? It's like I said before, it retreads some of what Part 1 did, but with its own new flavor, and it earns it. But what would JoJo be without batshit crazy villains? In this we have Cars, AC/DC, and Wham. I prefer to call him Wamu. That's the Japanese pronunciation, as well as how they translate it in the subtitles, to avoid copyright with the band Wham. But I don't know, Wamu just fits to me. Am I the only one? Like, I just feel like the way he looks and the general aesthetic of the character, I feel like Wamu is the kind of name he would have. But anyways, regardless, a total digression. He's the best one, by the way. I just want to totally point that out. He's fucking awesome. His wind abilities, just his personality and his philosophy is just awesome. And then you have Cars. And the thing about these guys, they're the Pillarmen. The thing about the Pillarmen is they're all likable, they're all really memorable, and they're all distinct from each other. And I love that about them. Like, Cars is really composed and evil and villainous, but then he has these batshit crazy moments.
Jojo!
And AC/DC, well, I don't really have much to say about AC/DC, honestly. There's a scene where he cries, but I don't want to give too much away because that's a really funny scene. And he has these cool, like, boiling blood fucking vein abilities, like I said, body horror villains. And, yeah, they're really interesting. Not like as people. As people, they're kind of just villains. You know, what makes them memorable and likable is what they do and say and how exaggerated they can be. But they're really interesting as far as their abilities go, because they're all distinct from each other. And they all have, well, I guess Wamu isn't quite as body horror as Cars and AC/DC, where Cars, like, has these blades come out of his arms and shit. But, yeah, it's just really cool. And they have their little quirks, too. Like, Cars doesn't seem to want to, like, fuck with nature. Like, there's this scene where he's about to land on flowers and he, like, knocks himself away so he doesn't, or he sees this this dog get hit by a car, or almost get hit by a car, and he kills the drivers. And it's just kind of, I wish you got more, I guess, of these, like, distinct character moments that these guys have, but still, they're interesting, and their abilities are interesting, and how they use them are interesting, and they make for really good villains. There are other characters in Part 2, of course, like Lisa and the training instructors, and Susie Q, and Speedwagon, but if I spend time talking about everybody, I'm going to be here all day. Returning characters are still fine. Most of the new characters introduced are pretty awesome. Lisa's fun. Stroheim, the Nazi, yes, the Nazi, is very fun. I guess I didn't mention this does take place in, like, World War II time. I mean, Nazi, so yeah, that pretty much gives it away, but yeah, instead of taking place in England, it takes place in New York, it takes place in Rome, Switzerland. They don't go all around the world like Part 3 or anything, but I like that there is more variety. It's not just old school Jack the Ripper era England. That's not me randomly describing it. That's how they described it in Part 1. They were like, it's England, Jack the Ripper's on the loose. That was literally how they described the time period. It's JoJo, what are you going to do? And Part 2 definitely feels like JoJo. I already said that, of course, but you've got the crazy color changing, the crazy kaleidoscope background filters. You've got the poses on top of poses on top of poses. So many poses. It's great. Yeah, JoJo really has this way of taking the meme-worthy, ridiculous sense of humor that it has that's arguably gives off so bad it's good vibes while still maintaining a sense of being quality. It's kind of weird. It's a weird paradox that JoJo sits in. But it takes those elements. It takes the serious, heartfelt elements where characters can die and things like that, and it really nails those moments and really captures those moments really nicely. And then it has, you know, the poses and the craziness, and it has the style and the flair, and it just, all of it just comes together really nicely. And like I said before, Part 2 really expands upon everything Part 1 had, with a new main character that actually develops over the course of the story. It's awesome. Like, it just is genuinely a really fun watch. I mean, I guess it's not for everybody. JoJo is really, really fucking weird, but I think it's worth checking out. I think Part 1 has a really, really good first episode, so check out Part 1. It's only 9 episodes. If you thought it was okay, or, you know, it was kind of cliche or generic or whatever, keep going. Give Part 2 a chance. It's very different, but still maintains that JoJo vibe and that JoJo flair. It's really cool, and even though it's not technically a sequel, I think it's one of the best sequels to something I've ever seen, is Part 2. Another great thing about Part 2 is that it doesn't overstay its welcome. Like, I feel like Stardust Crusaders, and if you guys are longtime fans, you might know, when I was reviewing Stardust Crusaders weekly, when they got to Egypt, I was getting a little tired of the same formula with these stand users. There was a lot of comedic stand users, and I really wasn't feeling it. It felt kind of like filler. In Part 4, I think did it better, because they paced it better in the anime, but still, Part 4 still kind of dragged its feet a bit. Part 2 is rushed. It definitely has rushed pacing. I guess I should talk about some of my criticisms of the series before I wrap this up, but it does have rushed pacing, but it doesn't overstay its welcome. You know, it stays just as long as it needs to. Could have been longer for sure, but it stays just as long as it needs to, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, which I think is a criticism I have of part 2, or part 3, excuse me, part 3 and part 4. They're a little longer than they need to be. They're a little too long for their own good. But getting back to criticisms, yeah, part 2, it is fast-paced. It's not as fast-paced as part 1, but they could have definitely done a better job here, though it is kind of hard to say what they could have done, because of course they could have made part 1 longer, and then, you know, spaced it out a bit more, let it breathe a bit more, but then part 2 wouldn't have had as much time to breathe. You know, part 2, because it's a 26-episode season, part 1 is 9 episodes. If you were to raise that to, say, 12 episodes, that's less episodes for part 2, unless you make it like, you know, a 39-episode season or a 38-episode season like part 4. Yeah, you know, I can understand why they'd want to do it the way they did it. It is what it is, but the pacing is a bit rushed, and then, of course, you have the animation, which, again, I don't know how much David Productions has done before Jojo, but I don't think it was much, and it shows. Jojo does not look... I mean, visually it's fine as far as the art style goes, but animation-wise, in terms of pure animation and movement and character acting, it relies very heavily on still frames, and relies very heavily on style, with crazy fucking, like, manga sound effects popping up, and color filters and stuff like that. It does definitely give it its own vibe, and its own feel, and its own flair, and definitely makes JoJo feel distinctly unique, but at the same time, the genuine animation and the genuine character movement in fighting and talking can be very stiff, very still frame heavy, very camera shake heavy. And yeah, for a seasonal series, it looks kind of lackluster in terms of animation. That's not to say there's no good cuts, because there's definitely good cuts of animation, but on the whole, it could look a lot better animation-wise, like Part 3 and like Part 4, which fall on those tropes as well, using the still frames and everything, and tropes is probably the wrong word to use, but you know what I mean. It falls on those same tactics, there we go. But there is a lot of really good genuine animation in Part 3 and 4 as well to balance it out, so... yeah, but those are really my only criticisms. Rushed pacing and animation issues. Other than that, I think Part 2 is just phenomenal. I would have given it a 9 out of 10, but I feel like those issues bring it down to like an 8, 8.5 out of 10. Still awesome. If you've seen Part 1, you've probably seen Part 2 because they're part of the same season, but if you haven't seen JoJo at all, I definitely recommend watching Part 1 to get to Part 2. But I digress. That's pretty much all I have to say. So, what do you guys think of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2 Battle Tendency? Go ahead and tell me in the comments section below. Give this video a thumbs up and share it on social media. Both those would help me out a lot. Subscribe if you haven't already, if you like what you've seen here. Click that little bell to get notifications when my videos go up. And I'll see you guys next time on Halloween month, where we talk about Stranger Things.